Should you upgrade? That's probably the question on a lot of S23 Ultra owners' lips, where they want to know what is going to be better about the S24 Ultra compared to the S23 Ultra. The obvious answer is probably no, but if you are still interested, this is the video where we compare everything between the S23 Ultra and the S24 Ultra. Now let's go. S23 Ultra owners have been spoiled. They have been treated to a smartphone that did everything they wanted it to do and a lot more last year in 2023. Samsung, though, in the yearly upgrade cycle that they're in, had to pack the S24 Ultra with more and more to try and bring consumers forward into the 2024 smartphone game. Realistically, people shouldn't upgrade year on year. It's probably not necessary. But if you're interested, and you probably are because you're watching this video, you'll want to know where the upgrades from the S23 Ultra to the S24 Ultra lie. That's honestly what we're going to be looking at. Now, a lot of people are just comparing the camera, and fair enough, Samsung do make a big song and dance, but there is so much more about this phone that is different to the S23 Ultra that should be spoken about. So the categories we're going to look at today, we're going to start off with the design, comparing how the in-hand feel, the materials used, and then also the display, because that kind of goes hand in hand together. We are, of course, going to look at the camera. It'd be silly not to, because there are some hardware changes this year and also some software processing differences that you probably should know about. And within that camera comparison, we're going to look at photos, we're going to look at videos, we're going to look at 5 times versus 10 times, 50 megapixels versus 10, and really just try and figure out, is the 5 times better than the 10 times? And does it have more flexibility? So that will be answered. And then we're going to look at software, because this launched with oneui 6.1. Currently, this is still oneui 6. And in that mix as well, we're going to look at the performance, because this is running the latest Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 for Galaxy, which has improved the capabilities versus the 8 Gen 2 for Galaxy. So let's dive into it, starting with the design. First impressions of both of these is they're the same, at least from a distance. You look at these two phones with the cameras next to each other, you'd be forgiven for thinking this is the S23 Ultra. But a very keen eye and someone who has held the phone in their hands will tell you that they are not the same. And the reason why is just the materials that Samsung have used and the subtle refinements that Samsung have made. The first thing that you'll notice pretty much straight away is that it's actually a little bit wider. And not by much. Samsung have slightly thickened the width to accommodate a slightly wider screen. And it's a bit shorter in height as well to still maintain that 6.8-inch screen at the front. But Samsung have also made the phone thinner, and not by much. It's 0.3 millimeters thinner in thickness this way versus the S23 Ultra. That isn't something that should be sneezed at, because they've managed to pack a lot more in here whilst not having as much space internally. That's probably not something you'll notice straight away. I don't know why I said that. The thing you'll notice straight away is the flatness of the display and the flat back glass. Samsung have done a complete 180 in that in the last pretty much 6 to 7 years, it's been all curved. They've lent heavily into that curved display, pretty much set the trend that the industry pretty much followed. But slowly but surely in the last few years, you've seen a bit of a change to go back the other way, especially in the base models. They went flat with the S21, but as they've sort of crept on with the Ultra, they've slowly but surely flattened out that curve. Last year with the S23 Ultra was probably the flattest we've seen it, but now with the S24 Ultra, it's flat. Now, keeping in mind that yes, the flatness is for the display area, but the bezel has actually got the slightest dip into the frame, which I'm okay with. I think that still maintains that kind of curved aesthetic ever so slightly, but the difference in how it looks, you won't pick up on that from a distance. That curved display, something to be said about it though, in the fact that its in-hand feel is really, really nice. But Samsung have maintained that in-hand feel to an extent with the thanks to the curved frame. And that frame is also different. They're now using a titanium finish around that frame versus the metal. And the metal frame with its glossy exterior felt slippery and weird. Like, I wouldn't say weird, but since holding the titanium of the S24 Ultra, it feels nice and sort of grippy in the hands, but also just has that nice premium feel to it to match the matte glass finish on the back. It's really nice. Part of this frame as well is Samsung have made a big cutout for the speaker. Whereas the S23 Ultra had little individual holes, this is one big opening. And I did a bit of a speaker test, so let's have a bit of a listen to that now. I think the S24 Ultra goes louder, but you be the judge and let me know. Let's deep dive into everything that this update has changed on Samsung's flagship tablet. let's deep dive into everything that this update has changed on Samsung's flagship tablet. Part of that flat display is Samsung have uniformed the bezels right around the screen. It's very, very small and it's even right the way around. It might look on the sides, at least anyway, you notice it a little bit more, but that's just because the flat display accentuates it. Doesn't mean there is more, because it's not the case at all. The bezels are smaller. And the frame around the outside, you see the frame, but not by much. In fact, it disappears when you start using the phone, and it just adds to that much nicer feel in the hand where you have the curve still. And that bezel is sitting around Samsung's best ever display in one of their phones. It has jumped leaps and bounds ahead of the S23 Ultra in so many different areas. Firstly, just on paper, the numbers themselves are enough. It goes from 1750 peak nits of brightness to 2600. And you notice it. Outdoors, you can absolutely see it, especially when taking lots of photos. You'll see side by side there is a difference in how bright the displays can go. It has to be in certain environments that this can do this, because indoors, you're actually not going to notice much. But outdoors, absolutely, you see it. But something that you do notice, no matter where you are, indoors, outdoors, is the reflectivity of the screen. Samsung are using Gorilla Glass armor to protect the display, and part of that is a 75% reduction in glare that hits the screen. And I put a post up on Twitter that kind of did its thing, and I absolutely noticed this in anything, whether that be indoors with my studio lighting, or whether that be outdoors when I'm at SeaWorld taking photos of the kids. You can absolutely see the lower reflectivity in the display, and it definitely makes for looking at things a lot easier when it's bright in certain situations. Another thing to be said too is the viewing experience is really nice. It doesn't mean that it's much different or better than the S23 Ultra. It's still great. And also the punch hole is smaller, so you might notice that. Something that'll add to the viewing experience too is an extra toggle in here in the display settings called adaptive color tone. Whole purpose of this is that depending on the lighting environment, it will adjust the tone of the display to suit. It actually uses the camera's rear and front to identify the lighting environment and then adjust accordingly. I wasn't sure I'd like the flat display being back, but the fact they've maintained the curved frame means that I'm okay with it. Let me know what you think. Which design do you prefer? The cameras on these have been a big talking point on X in the last few days. I have done my camera comparison before this supposed update, but my comparison isn't always just going to compare output. I actually look at the functional differences and the performance differences of the camera as well, because that should be taken into consideration, especially with optimizations which will likely come to the Ultra as time goes on. Starting with software differences, there's actually not a lot in the main part of the camera that's different compared to the S23 Ultra. The UI looks fairly consistent. The other thing you notice straight away is the difference in the telephoto range. There's a lot more options down the bottom, and Camera Assistant in the S24 Ultra allows you to tweak that a bit more, but I'll dip into that a little bit later. You obviously can see the difference, and you have 5x versus 10, but there's still the 10x button on the S24 Ultra as well. Something that I was immediately keen to test out is the shutter speed and how quick it was at capturing multiple images straight away. I never understood the fascination myself, but it was something that a lot of people care about, and definitely people on the internet like to speak about it. But it's not a thing anymore. Samsung have completely fixed that issue, and no matter what sort of environment you're in, you can smash that shutter button as quickly as you like, and it'll just keep capturing photos. And this is with the settings turned all the way up to maximum, prioritizing focus over speed and maximum quality in the intelligent options. You don't have to think about it anymore. It will just capture it. And the output's quite good. Next to the S23 Ultra, it's an obvious win, the S24 Ultra. Whether or not that comes in with One UI 6.1, I'm not sure, but it seems as if Samsung have gone to work and made it a lot better. Hardware wise, the big difference is the 5x 50 megapixel camera on the S24 Ultra, which has replaced the 10 megapixel 10x on the S23 Ultra. Lots has been said about this. So I went to work to compare, to figure out what you're actually missing and what you're gaining with this 5x camera. Starting with probably the most obvious comparison, 5x on the S24 Ultra compared to 5x on the S23 Ultra. Well, there's really no comparison. The S23 Ultra uses the 3x obviously to crop in to 5, and it has to use digital upscaling to try and fill in the blanks, whereas this is pure optical zoom at 5x. And the difference is absolutely noticeable straight away. No matter what sort of environment you're in, the 5x on the S24 Ultra is so good at taking photos compared to the 5x digital zoom on the S23 Ultra. But then you jump up to 10x 10x. And that's probably where a lot of people wanted to know what the difference was. And I'm pleased to say there's either a negligible difference in terms of quality, or the S24 Ultra sometimes edges it. One thing I noticed is that the S23 Ultra from a distance definitely looks maybe a slightly crisper, but when you do go into trees or grass or something like that, you can start to see a little bit of noise developing. Not sure what that is, but the S24 Ultra keeps it a little bit sharper. Zoomed out, the quality is quite comparable, and I think that's great. You know, some people wanted this drastic improvement at 10x, but I don't think you needed it. I think what you needed was it to be matched or slightly better, but allow for more range, because that's what this 50 megapixel 5x camera does, is it means that you can go from 3 to 10 and pretty much have a great photo at any length. I did 7.5 comparisons between the two, 7.5 on the S23 Ultra, 7.5 on the S24. And because the 50 megapixel is cropping in from that high resolution, it means you're going to get a good photo at any point between 5 and 10. Whereas the S23 Ultra, it's just not going to be the case. And you can see that difference with the 7.5 times photos that I took, that the S24 Ultra absolutely destroys it. But 10x is probably the one that's most important. No matter what you're taking photos of, whether it be signs. I took a photo of my kids from 10x away. They were sort of moving quite quickly in the playground. And my son's face is a perfect example of how the 10x on the S24 Ultra retained more detail and made it look more natural versus the 10x on the S23 Ultra. I don't think you should be concerned. If you are thinking about that upgrade and you were worried about losing 10x quality, don't. The S24 Ultra absolutely maintains it and in some ways improves on it. Beyond 10x, so at 30x, I think the S23 Ultra still has the upper hand here because it's starting from an optical level at a further away point, whereas the S24 Ultra has to play a little bit of catch up. It's not terrible, and in fact the difference isn't really that bad. In some instances, like this photo of a seagull, I was able to capture more detail on the S24 Ultra versus the S23 Ultra. A lot of that as well is probably down to the OIS, but I'll get to that when I talk about video and how much more stable that 5x camera is. At 100x, whatever. You won't be taking 100x photos, so don't worry about it. The big test for this camera was at night. Samsung were talking about how it was larger pixel sizes, 1.6 times bigger than the S23 Ultra's 10 times camera, and the sensor overall had a bigger size too, and a wider aperture, 3.4 versus 4.9. And you definitely can see more light coming in. I think Samsung probably need to do a bit of work on their processing. At the 10 times zoom range, the building that I was taking a photo of, it couldn't quite process the lights at the top, but the building was brighter and the sky you could see. Whereas the S23 Ultra pretty much blacked out the sky and had its priority on the lights and the little bit of the building. In a normal sort of low light 10 times, again, the S24 Ultra captured more light. You can see that. And the S23 Ultra kept it a little bit darker. So we'll have to see how this plays out as processing improves over time. At 5x, the S24 Ultra's like no contest. The S23 Ultra is obviously cropping in digitally. These were all taken in night mode, so I didn't test it in auto, but auto has night mode built into it kind of anyway, so it probably would end up with a very similar result. For fun, I took a photo of the moon at 30x. There's just a slight tinge in processing difference. Quality and detail wise are fairly similar, but apparently it's probably a fake moon anyway, so who knows. Wrapping that up, for me personally, I like the upgrade to the 5x camera and it being 50 megapixels. That 50 megapixels as well is quite flexible because you can take high resolution photos at that 5 times resolution. It does take some nice sharp images. You can have a look at some of them here, but I think the main purpose of this 50 megapixels is to give you that zoom range from 5 to 10 and having optical light quality anywhere in between. That offers more of a range versus the S23 Ultra, which is 3x and then 10x and a big jump in between that you have to make from a 10 megapixel camera. If you're thinking about upgrading, and the camera was one of the reasons why, that telephoto lens, absolutely an improvement. With that out of the way, I want to look at the photos next to each other. I took a lot of time to inspect and zoom in and crop into a lot of different images. The thing I noticed pretty much straight away is the processing was different from the S23 Ultra to the S24 Ultra. Samsung changed something. It didn't matter which camera I was looking at, so starting with the ultra wide, you can see that there's a very different sky difference, the tonal difference in the sky, different shade of blue on the S24 Ultra versus the S23. And then you're heading into the 1 times camera 2, I noticed quite evidently that, again, that same sort of processing was different. And the grass. The overarching thing was there was this golden warmish tinge to it. Samsung seemed to have changed their processing and shifted it to a more golden yellowish, I wouldn't say yellow, that's probably a bit harsh. Golden is the word I'll use. I didn't mind it because the setting I was taking a lot of photos in was at the beach, and you noticed that gold tinge at the beach when you're there. So I'm glad the photos sort of replicated that and brought that out. Whereas the S23 Ultra had that kind of cooler undertone to it and lifted the shadows quite a bit. Whereas the S24 Ultra seemed to favor slightly darker shadows, like ever so slightly in certain situations. Your ultimate preference here is processing, not necessarily detail. I did notice the S24 Ultra had some slightly sharper detail in trees, for example. Like there's this wide angle shot here of this tree looking out at Burleigh Beach, and when you crop into them, like the middle part of the tree, you can see the S24 Ultra has got some more detail about it. And I like that, because it means that Samsung's working hard to process the images to retain detail. Definitely point there to the S24 Ultra. But in a lot of situations, I took a lot of different photos at the beach, I took photos at SeaWorld, and I think the overarching theme is, yeah, there's some different processing happening here with the S24 Ultra compared to the S23 Ultra. Whether you prefer them or not, let me know in the comments below which side you're on here in terms of processing. It'll be interesting to see what Samsung do with this as the year progresses, because as we know, the S23 Ultra got some massive camera updates later down the track, especially when oneui 6 launched. You can go and watch that video on my channel now, birds, and that might interest you to see those differences as well. There's also 200 megapixels to talk about. Yeah, I think the thing I noticed with the photos that I took was that at 200 megapixels, the S23 Ultra was a bit dull, and then the S24 Ultra was vibrant. Detail-wise, I would say that's pretty negligible, slightly in favor of the S23 Ultra, but then at 50 megapixels, that was reversed. So you could see the differences there. I haven't put it up as a photo, I just recorded myself looking at it. For some reason, my Premiere Pro does not like 200 megapixel photos at all, so I'd prefer to avoid that. Before I dip into some of the software differences, Expert RAW, Samsung has enabled 24 megapixels that can be taken from the main camera, which is nice. I actually really like that change. It's just going to give you that extra bit of detail to work around with, sort of accentuate the photo a little bit more. I took a couple of different photos at 12 megapixel versus 24 versus 50. And yeah, you can definitely see that 24 is kind of like this nice sweet spot for processing and detail. So I hope to see Samsung optimize this further and even bring it into the main part of the camera. But for now, it sits in just Expert RAW. From a software feature point of view, Samsung have gone hard. I actually have another video planned, my next video, funnily enough, where I look at every single new camera feature that Samsung didn't announce, because they're there, but they didn't tell us about it. So hit your subscribe button, because that's going to be stacked. Samsung have gone crazy with adding new capabilities to the S24 Ultra's camera system. But I'll quickly cover a couple, some that I think might end up coming back to the S23 Ultra anyway. First one being single take. Samsung have now allowed you to take single take photos from any camera on the back. And I like this a lot. And it's not even just any camera. Like if you want to take a 5 or a 10 times, that option's there as well. The difference here between these two single takes is that from a distance with the S23 Ultra, it can't quite capture the scene well, and then using its AI, it doesn't really figure out what's happening. Whereas the S24 Ultra absolutely can go into that 5x and capture it more accurately and then spit out some pretty incredible photos. This black and white one of my son after he's sort of been swinging around on a tree is my new favorite photo of him. Absolutely love it. Just quietly, I'd use generative edit to actually remove something from the background, and you can see how well it actually has done, and it's made the photo even better than what it was. And then I added a blur effect for portrait mode, and there you go, solid photo. But part of the camera too is its performance improvement. It's processing single take a lot faster, so that's got to be considered as well. And the other change is portrait mode. Now with portrait mode, you can do 5x portraits. And I think that just increases the flexibility of how you can take your photos. It can do anything, like from 1 times, 2 times, 3 times, and then 5x. Whereas the S23 Ultra is always going to be limited to 3x as its maximum, because it just can't do 5x portraits. That's a definite upgrade that you can see. And you can see the photo at the end result. It's quite incredible. Something else Samsung spoke about is social media. Now, I'll leave that potentially for another video. If you do want to see a social media comparison between the S23 Ultra and S24 Ultra, let me know in the comments, because I'll work on putting something like that together. Video. I think this is probably where you'll notice a lot of function difference versus output difference. But there's also some really good output differences with the 5x camera, which we're going to start with. So like the photos, the 5x camera can be utilized for video. And what I really like with what this does is it just increases that video flexibility in that 5 to 10x range. Just starting off, let's do a comparison from 0.6 to all the way through to 20 times video. And you can see as you sort of progress through the stages, you can see the quality difference, especially once you hit 5x and move into 10x. That range between 5 and 10 is handled by that higher resolution 5x sensor on the S24 Ultra, whereas the S23 Ultra has to rely on that 10 megapixel camera. So it's going to steadily lose resolution as you go, whereas the S24 Ultra is going to process at the same resolution all the way into that 10x range. I absolutely think this is going to make for a much better experience when you are recording video, because pretty much anywhere from 0.6 all the way through to 10, you're going to get quality. If you are someone who takes a lot of video, this will improve it absolutely. The other thing too is Samsung spoke about the stabilization of the 5x camera being better than the 10x. They've improved the OIS and the video digital image stabilization that go along with it, and that's evident. At the 5x range versus 10x on the S23 Ultra, it is so much more smooth and stable as just sort of walking along. Those high magnification lenses, it can be hard to keep the camera stable. I tested this when I zoomed into a tree at SeaWorld, just to see the detail difference. When it went from 5 to 10 on the S23 Ultra, as soon as it hit the 10x, you notice the camera wobbling. That's because the standard sort of holding of the camera that I was doing wasn't enough to keep it stable. Whereas on the S24 Ultra, that didn't happen from the 3 to 5. It stayed stable because that OIS is working a lot better. Something else this 5x camera is capable of is 8K 30, because again, it's 50 megapixel camera, so it can take 8K footage. It makes 8K so much more functional because not only can you capture something from a distance at 1x, but you can then choose to go into 5x with a different video and capture the moment from closer in without having to move. And you're capturing it in that 8K, so it allows for further cropping in later if you need to. Opens up that flexibility of how this camera can work and really should be considered if you are someone who records a lot of video. With the S23 Ultra, you could record in 4K 60, but you couldn't change whilst you're recording. You could swap between the selfie and the rear camera, but that was it. With the S24 Ultra, Samsung have opened up 4K 60 to go any zoom length you want. And the actual changing of the cameras is very smooth. I was following my daughter along here in Burleigh the other day, and changing between the cameras at 4K 60 was great. What I really like with 4K 60 is the option to then use something like instant slow-mo, where you can long press down on the gallery and it'll slow the video up to sort of give you a bit of a preview, and using AI to fill in frames. It works quite nicely for that. But the thing that probably works even better is Samsung have enabled 4K 120 FPS in Pro Video mode. This is wild. The stabilization goes out the window at 4K 120, so you're probably wanting to keep this on a tripod. Even just looking at the quality of it, it's fast, and what I really like is the fact that you can slow it down in post. Samsung haven't enabled, for whatever reason, the instant slow-mo. Maybe it's processing too much frames, but you can go in later and change it to be slower, and it maintains that 4K quality and sort of keeps a lot of frames, so it's nice. In terms of just regular video output, so 4K 30, which is the optimal recording frame rate and resolution on the S series, the output differences are negligible. Stabilization wise, I do actually think the S24 Ultra has slightly shaded it in terms of giving you a little bit more stabilization. It's not a lot, so I wouldn't make the jump just for that alone. And the output, I also wouldn't make the jump for that either, just if you're recording at 1x. It's still going to process really nicely on the S23 Ultra. There's just some subtle differences, like maybe slightly darker shadows, for example, on the S24 Ultra. But the actual outputs on both are excellent. You won't have anything to complain about if you didn't upgrade from the S23 Ultra. Something Samsung spoke about is low light video. Yeah, I would say at 1x, there's maybe some differences and slightly processing the skies a bit better. And that's probably about it. Stabilization at night, I did notice a little bit better. What you'll want to probably know about is the low light video at a higher magnification length. At 5x and beyond, the S24 Ultra has it. I think it has it because at 10x and at 10x, the S24 Ultra is actually processing more light and allowing more light to come in, whereas the S23 Ultra, with the sensor being as small as it is and the aperture being as narrow as it is, it's not letting it enough. I think the processing is probably still better in terms of highlights, like flashing lights, for example, but when you zoom in on this sign at SeaWorld in this very dark, the jellyfish exhibit, there's not even a comparison. The S24 Ultra is just drawing in more light on the sign, and capturing more information. So in lower light, in video, absolutely will want the S24 Ultra. Again, because Samsung's probably going to optimize this as the year goes on. But again, it's just about whether that's an upgrade that's worth it for you or not. There's some other small video mode tweaks that Samsung have made, like portrait video. Samsung will now allow you to zoom whilst you're recording in portrait video, which I thought was a nice touch. The S23 Ultra, you had to choose either 1 or 3x, and that was it. The S24 Ultra, you can go up to 3x and 1x and anywhere in between. I'm yet to determine whether it switches to the 3x camera whilst you're recording, so I'll have to figure that out, but at least you can zoom and change range as you're going. There's a lot more video modes that Samsung have introduced. I want to save that again for that separate video. So that's my next one. So again, hit subscribe. So that wraps up the camera from an output and slightly function difference. Let me know which one you think did better, or if you think there's worthy upgrades in what I've shown you. Alright, software time. This is where I think some of the things you see might end up on the S23 Ultra, but it's not confirmed exactly yet what we will see. I think actually on Sam Mobile's website, they have a bit of a list over what is coming, but let's have a look now at what you got with the 6.1 versus 6.0. Just straight off, Samsung have just said 7 years of OS upgrades to the S24 Ultra. So that could be something you want to consider. You move from the S23 Ultra to this, and you have 7 years of support if you like the things that Samsung bring out on their software. Just to start with, that's something to think about. From a software level, there is a new always on display, which won't be going back to the S23 Ultra, and that is because of the new display that Samsung are using. Samsung have now enabled you to have your wallpaper as your AOD. I don't know if I like it yet. I've spent about a week with it being my AOD. The thing I don't like is that it just looks like my lock screen. Always go to unlock it and it doesn't swipe, so I start to get really annoyed. So I don't know if I'm going to keep it, and I don't know how it goes from battery. It hasn't seemed to be too bad just yet because I've set it to auto, where it will actually determine when it needs to be on. But yeah, Samsung have enabled it. I don't know. Let me know what you think. At least there's other options. That's what I like about Samsung. Within here too, there is a new erase background. So if you've got an object in your wallpaper, AOD can erase the background and keep just the object as you're always on display and then black out the rest. That could be a workaround if you don't like it completely looking like a wallpaper. That might be something you can turn on to give it a bit of a different feel. And there's some good transitions from wallpaper always on display all the way through to your home screen. So it's actually a nice transition that Samsung have made. The other thing that I really like is the Super HDR in Samsung's gallery. So if you go into the gallery, there's a toggle here to turn on Super HDR. I definitely noticed a difference in how the photos looked on the S23 Ultra versus the S24 Ultra. Same photo taken with the S24 Ultra, looked at on both, and you can see that there's more dynamic range in the building, especially in the building actually, compared to the S23 Ultra. So that's also something that is just a nice little tweak to have and looks better on this display. Samsung have also got some new battery protection features in here on the S24 Ultra. 3 little extra toggles versus just the one on the S23 Ultra. One I really like, it's basically will adapt how it charges overnight, and then as soon as it gets to maybe like an hour before you wake up, it pumps it back up to 100% and keeps it at that until you take it off charge. I like it in that I can actually have full capacity, whereas the Protect battery on the S23 Ultra limits it to 85%, and that's it, nothing else. Something I didn't like is that the navigation bar is now always present. I really miss being able to hide it. In the S23 Ultra's oneui 6, you can go in and hide the hint, the gesture hint as it's called. Can't do that on the S24 Ultra. And a large part of it is due to the circle to search functionality that Google and Samsung have worked on. There was probably something in there that meant they had to keep it present so people could think about it. And thankfully, circle to search is a very functional feature that allows you to quickly search something. A lot of people are saying it's just Google Lens. Yeah, it probably is, but it's way more accessible, and Samsung announcing it on stage at Unpacked has actually made people think about it and want to use it. I don't see the problem. The other incredible large part of the S24 Ultra is Galaxy AI. Now, I did just upload a video on Galaxy AI. Once you're done with this one, go in there and check out what Galaxy AI is all about and how to use each of the functions, because that is pretty much the biggest in terms of feature set upgrades that you get. Live translate, summarize, auto format, all that sort of stuff that can really change how you use your phone is in Galaxy AI, and it's in that video that I made. Performance. Well, I think we've all seen the benchmarks and the numbers. I'm not going to repeat any of that. That's not for me to do. What I like to talk about is how it feels to use from a performance standpoint. Battery wise, I think I've actually noticed this thing lasting longer than what I remember the S23 Ultra doing at the start. I'm a pretty heavy user, and especially someone who's figuring out a new phone, I'm on it a lot. But my first few days using this properly, I was finding it very hard to not end the day with between 35 and 40% with a heavy amount of screen on time. I think my first day my SIM card was in it. I had it for a week before it was announced, but I wasn't allowed to sort of put my SIM in it yet. I noticed that the battery was really good. I think I had about 5 hours screen on time and about 45% of battery left, and I take it off charge pretty early in the morning. And over time, it's still sort of performing quite well. Like today, it's 1 p.m. in the afternoon, and I am at 85% battery and stopped charging about 4 hours and 54 minutes ago. And estimated 1 day and 5 hours left of battery. I will say it'll happily get me into the second day, no problem. So battery and the new 8 Gen 3 for Galaxy is something that's enabling that with its better efficiency, but also probably the more efficient display and a lot better cooling that Samsung have put in here. From an user interface point of view, the animations, I'm not a stickler for animations, I don't care. But what I like is that the ceiling that animations give you mean that it's going to improve everything underneath. And this is starting from a higher ceiling than what you have on the S23 Ultra. Just feels that slightly snappier to use when you're opening and closing things and moving around somewhere quickly. Whereas the S23 Ultra, it wasn't sluggish by any means. It just has a different feel about it. I can't quite explain it other than just feels different, but also feels nicer. But you'd want it to if you're upgrading. The other two things for me that I really like to test is how it works when you're editing videos and editing photos, and then the exporting of those two things. And yeah, I think the S24 Ultra definitely is a showcase of the improvements that Samsung have made when it is doing both of those things. The speed difference, but also just the performance difference and how it feels when it's doing it is better. And that's pretty much the phone itself. It works faster across so many different areas thanks to that 8 Gen 3 for Galaxy that Samsung have introduced. So, two phones, both named Ultra, one generation apart. The differences, at least on surface level, aren't really there. But when you dig deep into the actual features themselves and what the processor enables, that was what made this phone so good. Is the processor improved so much on the S22 Ultra from a seemingly similar phone that you actually felt the difference in it. This year is going to be the same, with the slightly refined design, but with the way better sort of thought out performance, all the way from chipset through to the new 5X camera and everything that lies in between. It's going to be the phone to beat this year. If you're thinking about upgrading and those things all sound important to you, then go ahead. But if you've sat here and watched this video and thought, you know what, this is still really good, this still performs good, and the photos are still great, I don't need to, then sit on it. Wait a couple of years and see what's to come next. Maybe it's a foldable. We don't know. Thank you very much. I've got plenty more of content planned for this one. My next video is going to be about all the secret features because Samsung packed new stuff in here and never tell anyone. So I'm going to do it for them. Make sure you subscribe for that. Go watch some of my other S24 Ultra videos, some of the other S23 Ultra videos as well. And between now and then, come and find me on my social media, Twitter/X, and also on Instagram. I'll see you in the next one. You!